On behalf of the Seminar Planning Committee and also the Center for the Study of Racism, Social Justice, and Health in the School of Public Health, I just want to welcome everyone out today. We are delighted to host Dr. Darrick Hamilton. Just going to read his bio for you. He is the Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at the Ohio State University, and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. In addition, Professor Hamilton holds a primary faculty appointment in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, with courtesy appointments in the Departments of Economics and Sociology in the College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Hamilton is a pioneer, an internationally recognized scholar in the field of stratification economics, which fuses social science methods to examine the causes, consequences, and remedies of racial, gender, ethnic, tribal, nativity-related, etc., forms of inequality in education, economics, and health outcomes. And this work involves crafting and implementing innovative routes and policies that break down social hierarchy, empower people, and move society toward greater equity, inclusion, and civic participation. And as one who is very concerned with how do we think about these things and then move towards documenting them or exploring them empirically, I really have celebrated your work and the thoughts, the ways that you push us, various fields for many years. So welcome to this.
Great. So I've known Chandra for a very long time, from our days when we were rooting for the Tar Heels back at UNC. We're suffering a little bit this year, but y'all have suffered. But in all earnest, it is an honor and privilege to be here. There are several faces in the room that I have known for a while and are allies in this work that I do. I've co-authored with multiple people in the room and served on boards and gone through postdocs, and they have been involved in my development, so there's gratitude in that. And I guess I'm at the point in my life now to pay it forward and train next generations. So I appreciate all that you all have done, and UCLA in particular, in keeping that pipeline and flow going. So what I'm going to do today is probably a series of multiple talks. I'm going to try to frame a political economy of economic, political power, and the strategic role that stratification and race plays in forging that concentration of economic and political power. And then also talk about an alternative policy frame to break up that 40-year concentration that 45-year concentration that we've been experiencing. And then I'll go to slides and do more of actually it won't even be traditional, but more of a perhaps Q&A, call and response type reaction to slides and ideas that I'll present. If you want to interrupt at any time, I'm okay with that as well. And then let me just get into it. So the American ideals of economic inclusion, civic engagement, and social equity, they have yet to be realized. As we become more plural, it's critical to view race in this relationship as a pillar in our political economy, rather than thinking about it as an issue. To achieve a shared prosperity and the ideals of a moral and just economy, we need a new vision beyond neoliberalism. We need a 21st century economic Bill of Rights, and educators and university communities have a critical role to play in that. As an Economic Policy Institute report entitled "The Productivity Pay Gap Vividly Displays," there's been a disturbing trend for the last 45 years. Essentially all the economic gains from America's increasing productivity have gone to the elite and upper middle class, while real worker wages have remained roughly flat. This has manifested in a concentration of wealth where the top 1/10% of earners in the U.S., those making above $1.5 million per year, own as much of the nation's wealth as the bottom 90%. Moreover, the bottom 50% of earners own about 1% of our nation's wealth. This obscene concentration and its accompanying plutocracy, the likes of which hasn't been seen since the Great Depression, it is not natural, nor is it our destiny. In response to the Gilded Age, which preceded the Great Depression, that brought the American economy almost to the brink of collapse, or actually to the brink of collapse, the New Deal reined in unfettered capitalism and corporate consolidation and provided a balance of power between labor and capital that set a foundation for a strong labor movement. However, by both design and implementation, black people and black institutions were largely frozen out of that. Indeed, the passage of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act, guaranteed Americans the right to organize and bargain collectively, and it served as a critical safeguard for workers against the exploitation of a corporate elite. But again, because of a Faustian bargain, to convince legislators in a southern Jim Crow, largely Jim Crow state apparatus to come abroad, the Wagner Act excluded black Americans from these protections. It was not accidental that the Wagner Act excluded domestic and agricultural workers, when in the 1930s, 90% of black women were either domestic or agricultural workers, and over half of black men. The New Deal economics frame is in contrast to a neoliberal frame and free market revolution, which occurred around the early to mid-1970s, that emphasizes deregulation, tax cuts, and tax incentives to cajole or bribe the private sector to provide more jobs under the lure that this is going to deliver a dynamic, innovative economy that's supposed to trickle down to all of us. The neoliberal approach explains poverty and inequality as deficiencies internal to the poor and blacks themselves. Stigmatization based on race and anti-blackness, they are strategically used as political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control of the underclass. Blacks have become the symbolism by which we define a surplus population. They're defined as persistently unemployed and unemployable, a source of urban crime and malice, and whose subsistence needs are deemed a drain on fiscal budgets. The promise of economic prosperity and relative racial progress of a neoliberal economic paradigm for black Americans has never materialized. And worse, blacks, along with government social programs, they become the scapegoat that has allowed the neoliberal agenda to persist despite growing inequality. In addition to wage disparity, mass incarceration, and wealth disparity, the neoliberal era is associated with other vulnerabilities like predatory finance, municipal fees, fines, and debt, directed at a population that is economically and politically vulnerable, shortages of affordable housing and the instability associated with eviction, food insecurity, environmental injustice, and now we're starting to observe climate gentrification. The neoliberal approach radically situates the market as a great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our work and the solution for all our problems, economic or otherwise. The framing pays little attention to the roles of power and initial capital or endowment, and how power and capital can adjust and alter the rules and structure of transactions, in other words, markets, to privilege power and capital in the first place. Power and capital are self-reinforcing, and without government intervention, they do what they do best. They generate an iterative cycle of both stratification, consolidation, and inequality. Without capital, inequality is locked in. We use words like choice and freedom to describe the benefits of the market, but choice is an illusion for an individual that lacks a basic job, adequate income, shelter, food, and health care. It is literally wealth that gives us choice, freedom, and optionality. It is critical to note that it was never the case that a white asset-based middle class simply emerged. Rather, it was government policy, and to a large extent, literally government giveaways, and perhaps a better word would be entitlements, that provided whites with the finance, education, land, infrastructure to accumulate and pass down wealth. In contrast, blacks were excluded from much of this policy that created these wealth-generating benefits, and when blacks were able to accumulate land and enterprise, it was politically vulnerable to be stolen, destroyed, or seized. So to achieve racial justice, we need an honest and sobering confession of the historical sins of slavery, a point in American history when blacks were literally capital assets for a white landowning plantation class, for sharecropping, for whitecapping, for Jim Crow, and exclusion of blacks from New Deal and post-war policies that ultimately built an asset-based white middle class. This authentic analysis would counter the neoliberal frame that caricatures black, brown, and poor people as welfare queens, as deadbeat dads, and undeserving, and instead paved the way for narratives that more accurately frame inequality as grounded in resource deprivation. However, acknowledgement and an apology, those things would be empty if not accompanied with some form of material redress. A reparations program provides a retrospective, direct, and parsimonious way to address the black-white wealth gap. Moreover, it is a racially just policy because it requires the U.S. to take public responsibility and atone for its long history of racial injustice. Right? A key thing to understand about our history is that it was state complicit. So a lot of the things that I described earlier were either the direct result of state actions or complicity from the state. A seed capital program, like baby bonds, is an economically and racially just prospective approach since it targets the domain and outcome in which whites and blacks have very little overlap, and that would be wealth. The permanent seed capital program would provide everyone with a capital foundation to build wealth and asset security in perpetuity, and it would trend us towards a just and egalitarian distribution of capital and wealth access for everyone at birth. To address our growing plutocracy resulting from our growing gross concentration of wealth, we need a redistributive wealth program, a wealth tax, or some sort of estate tax with teeth to address that concentration, and frankly, what we're observing now, the ability to buy an election. But to fully understand the iterative concentration of both economic and political power and why the status quo of growing inequality has persisted, we need to embrace a third pillar in this relationship, and that is race, or more broadly, the existence of an underclass marked by some subaltern identity by which more dominant identity groups might be willing to trade off their vertical positioning in exchange for horizontal positioning, basically relative status, in order for that paradigm to persist. In other words, as America becomes more unequal, the appeal to whiteness or horizontal status becomes more. So you might tell somebody you might not be able to control your lot in life in general, but at least you're not Mexican, or at least you're not black, or at least you're not a woman, right? You're able to use horizontal status as a trade-off for vertical positioning in order to allow a political system that trends towards concentration of economic and political power to persist. It's not hard to see this theory play out. In the 2016 presidential election, it caught most political pundits and political scientists off guard. But if we view this perspective from a stratification economics lens or a critical race theory lens, the results become less surprising. President Donald Trump's divisive appeal towards whiteness, it was loud, it was boisterous, and it was clear. His campaign slogan of "Making America Great Again," a fictional period in which white dominance was unchallenged and unquestioned, and his not so subtle dog whistle that "I am your last chance," with overtures of the pending demographic shift and in which whites are expected to no longer be a numerical majority, that was all about codifying the property rights and whiteness. Two things we know are unambiguous from racial stratification: black workers are made worse off. Second, the capitalist class, which is overwhelmingly white, is made better off. What is ambiguous is economic positioning of a white working class. And that's because white privilege offers tangible, material, and psychological benefits. But this privilege is based on an immoral or an amoral notion of benefit. It's a benefit that's largely predicated on self-interested, neoliberal and tribal norms in which accumulation knows no bounds. An authentic racial coalition to address our growing inequality, it would necessitate that the dominant white class give up the benefits of white privilege, which is obviously not an easy ask to make. The good news is that change may be happening. Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, and the recent youth-inspired global climate strike demanding the end of the use of fossil fuels, these are all examples of younger generations and social movements, how they're redefining economic good to incorporate the principles of our common humanity, our common sustainability, and shared prosperity. But to achieve these ideals, we need a sustained politics that's not narrowly constrained by what seems feasible, where feasibility is defined by a politics of the here and now, or our immediate past, which has been dominated by an economic consolidation and plutocracy at the top. We need a bold, transformative economic Bill of Rights that is consciously legislated and implemented in a racially inclusive way. Basically, we need an anti-racist economic Bill of Rights. Public policy should empower all people to live a dignified life and should shield vulnerable populations from predatory actors whose myopic focus on profit drive them to extract and exploit. Reparations, a federal job guarantee, baby bombs, they could form a three-legged stool of economic justice more broadly and racial economic justice specifically. There are a set of enabling goods and services that are so critical for individual life, liberty, and self-determination that their quantity, their quality, and access to them should not be vulnerable to the pricing and rationing that comes about from firms trying to meet profit-maximizing fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders. We need policies where the public directly competes with and crowds out inferior private options that do not ensure universal quality health care, housing, schooling, financial services, capital, and the free mobility of people without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm at the hands of a state-sanctioned terror because someone's social identity is linked to a vulnerable or stigmatized group. Across the globe and throughout history, extreme inequality persists, and in plain sight, racism, sexism, and other isms are used strategically to consolidate economic and political power for some at the expense of others. This is unjust, it is immoral, and it's all about power relationships. Understanding the persistence of extreme inequality and the pivotal roles that race and other group identities such as gender, disability status, sexual orientation, how they work in forging alignments and economic divisions, that should be the core of university mission. And given the emergent inequality in political context, now is the time to do more. The time has come to be bold, transformative, and to use our scholarly endeavor to take the problems of inequality and stratification head on. In closing, we can reject the empirically unsubstantiated rhetoric that ignorance and so-called grit and personal responsibility, that those things are the sources of inequality, and the accompanying neoliberal paternalism in which a government attempts to coerce or incentivize insinuated defective people to behave accordingly and make better decisions. Instead, we can change the paradigm. We can be bold, we can work at federal, local, state levels, we can go into progressive, conservative communities and advocate for programs and initiatives that truly empower people with economic security, with dignity, and with agency to define and achieve their goals. And finally, we can have a long-term vision not caught up in the myopic, neoliberal scarcity frame, which at the outset constrains us from reimagining the society that we might want and deserve. So that's the preamble. present some basically descriptive data to support some of these claims I'm making, but I guess I should ask if there are questions before I can do that. And then I guess I'll be aware of that clock, that's my time, and I go to 1:30, I guess. Okay. All right. Any questions, comments before I go? All right. You all agree? Wow.
So California.
Oh. So I'm not in Ohio.
I think what you're asking is a political question. And so the extent of the extremes of wealth concentration and the dominance of neoliberal conservative politics in our institutions, those to me seem magnificently powerful. So what is your imagination of a path forward?
Yeah. So, and the other big thing I'm trying to interject is...
Because I don't think anybody disagrees with we should be doing this, and a lot of us are doing that.
Yeah.
But the extremes of the polarization and the extremes of the politics makes where that path forward is the hardest question to answer.
You know, people raise the narrative that poor white people are irrational to vote for Donald Trump. And I say, no, they're not. They know exactly what they're doing. He knows exactly what he's doing when he appeals to them. So the third pillar that I'm trying to interject is the role that race has played in allowing this system to persist. And we always talk about race as an issue. We almost think about it as an afterthought. But understanding the dynamics between vertical positioning and horizontal positioning, I think is critical if we want to make hay and moving forward to dismantle it. How is it that we can have a political system that persists with this growing concentration and people don't rebel against it? Well, we scapegoat a community. Well, we offer a community that is the dominant political entity, both material and psychological benefit at the expense of others. So that, to me, has become the trade-off. It's not unique to this point in history, nor the United States, but seems to be what's done in a global context, and where I think we need to have a more thought and evolution in our understanding of, I'm not telling you anything new, and you're not either, about political and economic consolidation. That's been done a lot. But the role that race plays in that, I think that's the new part, and that's where we need further development. And if we are able to appeal to people's humanistic sensibilities in an authentic way, I think that becomes the solution.
So I use my...
Here and then here.
So, sort of a little bit following off of this, so Canada had truth and reconciliation with sort of its indigenous peoples. The U.S. has never had that with sort of the history of slavery or its indigenous peoples. I mean, we just went through this very public sort of impeachment here, and lots of facts were put out there. So my question is, it seems like it's a political question, and it'll take us a lot to get there. Is there a need first, sort of, to move before we think about reparations, before we think about other, to get society there? And is a truth and reconciliation sort of step one? And is this something? And even if we do it, will anybody be convinced? Because truth and reconciliation may not matter anymore. I don't know. That's the question.
Yeah, we are in a new era, so you're right. Yes, I think that it is. Some people talk about reparations and say, we don't need the commission. We already know it's wrong, and we should just go at it. No, I think the commission is necessary. I think the full authority of some sanctioning body to have that sobering truth and integrity around what actually happened is necessary, not even just for reparations of the specific group of interest, but to change narratives about poverty more general. We frame, I'm going to use a bad word, we frame white poverty in a way that we niggerize the white poor. We use terms that we apply to black people to poor whites, and they get othered. I'm not the first to say this, but the term white trash is the signal that you're something other than white. We don't have an accompanying black trash term. but for white people, we have to distinguish the poor from good, well-meaning, good white people, right? So I think that truth and reconciliation would help to dismantle the mythology around neoliberalism and really understand that the source of poverty is resource deprivation as opposed to some behavioral deficit. And it is also a building block if we ever are going to have the redress. I think the point is that if we only did the apology, you know, right now in the political season, when people want to run for president, all the grievance, all the things that they've done to black people in the past, they have to do the apology tour. So they have to say, I'm sorry. I think it's an inauthentic apology. It becomes a convenient apology, especially if it doesn't have redress. If you're not, you know, I can pick on people, I guess. Look, we got tenure, we can say whatever we want. You know, Bloomberg is a $60 billion person, right? He caused harm to people in New York with stop and frisk, where people's lives were disrupted and destroyed in a lot of ways. So an apology is not enough from my view. Right, so this is trying to use it as a metaphor for something bigger. If the U.S. takes accountability, that wouldn't be enough. If it doesn't have redress, when you tell your children, if a corporation engages in malfeasance, the proper way to do an apology is to have some redress as well. So I think with reparations, we would need definitely the full-throated apology and recognition of what happened, but I think you need the redress also, and that their complements are necessary. And then notice that when I talk about an economic bill of rights, I'm for race-specific policies. I'm not opposed to them, but only one I list has been reparations, right? I think that reparations also won't be enough. Reparations is critical and important, but I also think we need prospective policies to account for what happens going forward. I think that in general, there's a tendency for political and economic power to trend towards consolidation, so that means that as a state, there needs to be something in perpetuity to allow for greater distribution of that power.
Yeah, so thank you very much for coming. Your work is really illuminating in so many different ways. And I apologize, I'll miss some of your descriptive statistics since I have to leave early. But the question I wanted to ask has to do with coercion and where it fits into your analysis, by which I mean I can't identify a moment in U.S. history when social change has happened without coercion. So it's less about the best argument, it's less about the empiricism, it's about a moment where people have been forced to do something that they didn't want to do. So even as we now might go back and celebrate Brown as this moment of achievement, this uncontroversial good, in that context, it was incredibly controversial. The Civil Rights Act, Reconstruction. I mean, you picked a moment that we might now celebrate as a kumbaya moment. It wasn't a moment where the nation came together and said, let's do the right thing. I mean, people had to be pushed somewhat coercively into that positionality. So I'm wondering how coercion fits at all into your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, you probably think and have thought better about it than me, but you know, there's going to be tension. Power's not going to concede in an easy way, but social movements run up against tension, right? So, you know, I think that's going to be a battle. So I don't have a good, insightful answer to your question, but to say that power does not want to relinquish itself because it's power, and it is about consolidation and maintaining control. But social movements is a pathway towards redirecting that power, perhaps in a coercive way, and I'm hoping that's what we're experiencing right now. I mean, I feel like there is a generational shift. I feel like young people, I mean, we can look at electoral politics and see it. If we take Bernie Sanders as an example, his base, despite being the oldest man in the election, I think that's true, is young people, is millennials, right? And that seems to be something generationally going on where they're, I guess, coercing our society in a different way around the concepts of justice, away from the concepts of if you only go to UCLA and get a good education, that's your pathway forward towards success. And the others who don't, that's why they're poor. All right, so as y'all can see, I'm not somebody that doesn't lead with values. As an academic, I'm motivated to lead with a moral compass. And the notion that there's this distinction between positivist approach and normative approaches, I don't believe it to be true. I believe that every academic starts with some norms. There's no such thing as a strictly positivist approach, and I say that my discipline is largely guilty of characterizing itself as being positivist, and it becomes reductionist to a dogma based in a set of assumptions that's supposed to be true, that you have these atomistic agents coming together to engage in exchange to lead to the best well-being for society. But I've recently been schooled by my political scientist friends that markets are political constructions. There's no such thing. Even a farmer's market is a political construction. That's usually, people usually give me that as the example. What about a farmer's market? You got to get a permit. You got to have a click, right? Those are political constructions. So own your values and be upfront about what your values are. I'd say that part of a problem, again, with my discipline is that we've moved away from political economy. It's become almost an albatross, as if it's somehow weaker. But there's nothing weak or not rigorous about understanding issues of distribution and equity, and I don't think you have to sacrifice rigor in order to pursue those entities. All right, so that's my soapbox. I was going to show a video about wealth, but I've been on a soapbox long enough. I'm going to keep going. So we know that the racial wealth gap is...
Was that a real picture?
Huh?
Was that a real picture, or is that...
That's a real picture. Oh, now you want me to show the video. My friend Michael, I want to flex.
Go ahead.
Make it full screen. Here we go.
The sound?
Here we go. All right, no video.
Photoshop in Bloomberg.
All right, so anyway, the racial wealth gap is persistent and it's stubbornly persistent. Some people, and we can see that after the Great Recession, it got even larger. Right, the racial wealth gap between, this is looking at whites versus blacks, same thing for Latinx. It went from large to even larger. So some people have even given the narrative that the Great Recession wiped out black and Latinx wealth. I don't think that's an accurate description because it's not as if the populations of blacks and Hispanics have ever had a real substantive amount of wealth. I think more accurately is that the racial wealth gap was long and persistent and became exacerbated after the Great Recession. So we traditionally think of the middle class in terms of income, education, and occupation, but they underestimate the scope of financial insecurity. If you want to make grandiose changes in your life, you oftentimes aren't going to fund it out of income. If you want to go to an expensive either grade school or university, it's not going to be income to finance that. If you want to influence political campaigns, if you're confronted with an expensive legal system, if you want to have the financial security to leave your job and start a business, it is wealth by which we're able to finance those things. Also, wealth is a concept that usually occurs in perpetuity. In other words, it's not exhausted from its use. Wealth provides something that appreciates over time, right? Whereas income is usually a flow good and it goes towards consumption at one period in time, right? And then some people will say, well, you can save income. Active savings is not a large component of what most Americans engage in. When Americans generate wealth, it's usually as a result of asset appreciation. Having something like either a home that grows in value or being in an occupation for which you're able to get matched savings towards your retirement, or the vehicles to allow you to save. And if we think about the black middle class, there's never been a black middle class if we define it in terms of wealth. There's been headway in terms of education, income, and occupation, but never in terms of wealth. And there was a little brief that we produced, Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain, Why Studying Hard Isn't Enough for Black Americans, which I think kind of demonstrates this. If you look at black individuals where the head of household attained a college degree, they tend to have less wealth than white families where the head dropped out of high school. And you also find that when we look at employed versus unemployed, black families where the head is working full time typically has less wealth than white families where the head is unemployed. And if you're black and unemployed, you virtually have no resources to deal with your situation. We can look at wealth inequality in a gender frame, so look at black versus white women across the life course, whether or not they're married or single-headed households, and also whether or not they have a bachelor's degree. And some things that stand out when looking at these statistics, and again, this is not dynamic, this is cross-sectional from the PSID. If we look at black head of households, whether they're married or single, those with a bachelor's degree typically have less wealth than their white comparison. If we look at aging throughout the life course and comparing, in this case, single black and white families with a bachelor's degree, we see that black women under the age of 30 have negative net wealth. And that's probably as a result of the student debt that we're asking people to acquire in order to get a college degree. And that this disparity looks like it gets larger throughout the life course, where we see that in the twilight of one's life, that the gap is the largest. I think that's an 81 time difference between what white women have in their net wealth position versus that of a senior black woman. If we look at the role of incarceration in wealth, so this study is going the other way. It's saying, well, does wealth shield you from incarceration? By the way, we looked and asked, did incarceration differentially impact one's wealth, black or white? And we do find, probably to nobody's surprise, being white and incarcerated has a less dampening effect on wealth accumulation than being black and incarcerated. And there were indeed examples of black households that were previously not incarcerated that had lower wealth than white households that would have experienced some incarceration. But looking at this is based off NLSY. I'm going to skip this unless somebody wants to see the details, but this is what I want to show, which is a graphic that the Washington Post used from the study. So the Washington Post published this, and it shows that if you look with the NLSY, we can trace people from when they're just entering young adulthood and whether they end up incarcerated by the age of 55. And we can look at the wealth position that they started their young adulthood as and the likelihood of incarceration. And probably to nobody's surprise, those that are more wealthy tend to have a lower likelihood of ever being incarcerated. But if we look at the gradient for whites, it's lower in general. It's still a gradient, but we get scenarios where if you were white and grew up with low wealth or started your young adulthood in a position of low wealth, you had a lower likelihood of incarceration of many black families that had higher levels of wealth. So wealth, unfortunately, does not protect people the same depending on one's demographic group as well. If y'all got questions as I go, please feel free to ask.
How come, which is I'm looking at the 10th percentile. And for blacks and whites, it's the same, essentially. Is there any particular explanation for that?
Yeah, one thing I'm not presenting also is that you can imagine that the cell sizes for blacks here are very small because there's not that many black people with that level of wealth. But I don't have a better answer beyond it could be noise. There's no statistical tests that are done here either. Like I'm not testing for significance. I'm presenting the description. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think you're right, it's sample size. Could be easily sample size.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can do this for women as well, and you get a similar pattern, but the cell sizes of incarceration become much smaller for women.
One of the things that strikes me, and I'm sure you're going to keep showing slides and maybe show it, but the thing that keeps coming back to my mind is that what's not shown there is the intergenerational transfers of wealth by income or education.
Yeah.
And there you would see probably tremendous intergenerational transfers of wealth to whites across the income education distribution that you won't find. Your initial argument about the political economy apparatus that ignited wealth accumulation, especially in the 40s and 50s in the United States, moves through housing market, moves through financial asset market, distributes much differently for whites than blacks. That then can explain why it is that low educated, unemployed whites have much more wealth than comparable blacks.
Yeah. I mean, wealth is the most powerful tool I can use to diffuse the notion that America is a meritocracy because of the intergenerational nature of it. The other point that I like to make is wealth is often thought about as an outcome, but the real power of wealth is what it can do for you, the agency that it affords you, including leaving bequests to your children in perpetuity, right? So I think you are spot on that, a white family is more likely to receive an inheritance. But the other point that we don't think about when we think about transfers is the intergenerational, we think about the intergenerational transfer of affluence, but there's also the intergenerational transfer of networks of poverty. So, I'll give you an example. Baby bonds is a policy that I advocate for a great deal. So it's arguing for a birthright to capital for everyone, and the amount that you get at birth is based on the family financial circumstance that you're born into. And then that money can be used when you become a young adult to purchase an asset like a home, a debt-free college education, or some capital to start a business. So some people have critiqued it and said, well, why add that paternalistic element to restrict it to some asset-enhancing endeavor? You're a good economist. Let people spend the money the way they want to spend it, right? Well, the intergenerational transfer of affluence is also, the policy, I'm not opposed to transfers of income, but the policy is directed at addressing wealth inequality. And I know that there are many black families that when they're a young adult, they're going to have an aunt who's going to get evicted, a mother who might need a medical treatment or something like that. So because of larger networks of poverty to begin with, if I'm trying to address the wealth gap, then that's a paternalistic aspect, not meant to chastise people's decisions, but to protect them from the fact that they're more likely to live in higher networks of poverty as well. So despite those inequality, the inequality that I showed you, this is the political context that we live in. I guess Trump is making it less so today, that we can say that America has largely transcended the racial divide. Fewer people are necessarily saying that now that he's in office. But nonetheless, there's a shift of public responsibility for the conditions of black Americans. We have a lot of rhetoric of blacks need to get over it, stop being the victim role, stop making excuses, take personal responsibility, study hard, graduate from college, and get a good job. Well, I already showed you how that translates into wealth for a black person, at least descriptively. The neoliberal approach basically says that, and I kind of went through this already in the talk, so I won't have to go through it in detail here, but basically some notion that if we allow the market to be the efficient distributor of good behavior and bad behavior, smart decisions, bad decisions, and that the government can come in to address behavioral modifications, that if we can convince people to invest in their personal well-being, in their human capital, that's the key to addressing poverty. Bloomberg said it yesterday in the debate. He said that the solution to poverty is education. Right? That's a neoliberal frame. He's not unique in that. I'm picking on him, but that's a common theory and understanding in our society, that if only people get a good education, they'll be fine. And this becomes the rationale for austerity policy. That why fund government programs that are going to misallocate resources to these irresponsible individuals that are making bad decisions? Or worse, you're going to create incentives for dependency to further fuel irresponsible behavior. So hence the focus on policy becomes education and the rehabilitation of black families to make better decisions and behavioral modification.
But wouldn't you say that education is a necessary, even though not sufficient, condition for establishing upward mobility, for creating upward mobility? And if you put that together with the baby bonds idea and maybe restitution and so on, so that you attack the creation of the racial differential in wealth, but then say education's part of it, rather than ignoring education.
Yeah.
I assume you'd agree to that, right?
So I would not disagree that there is some functional role of education in producing well-being. I think we exaggerate it. I think we exaggerate the functional returns of education to the extent of understanding the functional role of resources. And I think that it's also become a political ruse to do so, that it becomes easy to just say, if we just invest in education, that's the solution, without understanding structural context. And then I'll make another point. I love the title of that paper, Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain. Because simply observing people with high levels of education and high levels of income, we don't know the causal mechanism. I know that in wealthier societies in general, you're going to have higher education because they can afford higher education. And again, I led with, I'm not going to deny that there's some causal relationship. But the question is how much and do we exaggerate it? But I'll tell you where my values are. I think education as a good is an important enough reason to invest in it, period, irrespective of its investment capacities. So having a society where people are able to synthesize information into big ideas, that in and of itself is a good and meaningful and a reason to advocate for, in my view, tuition-free public education without debt. So I guess I'm answering your question in twofold. One is, I do believe it's a political ruse, the extent to which we exaggerate its functionality. And then two, by no means am I suggesting that it shouldn't be a national priority, because it as an outcome is a good enough reason.
Can there also be two things and then a nuance? Two things is we have to think about what we do as individuals and what we do as a society. And as an individual, I can't change society tomorrow, but I can make some decisions about how can I gain the most advantage out of whatever the structural disparities are. And certainly education is a choice that could be made. We want to give people the sense that there's some return to that. The second is that ruse, that political ruse about education, is a rhetoric that then is not backed up by action. Education is meaningless unless you provide people with decent K-12 education and preschool. Before that, it's meaningless unless you provide the access that people can afford to higher education in good ways. So that should be ratcheted back to say, okay, if that's going to be the avenue you're going to advocate, then you have to be an advocate for actually making schools high quality across the board for every single neighborhood. You have to make access to higher education available without putting people into extreme debt so they can't build up the wealth that we know in the long term is so instrumental to security, so instrumental to allowing the next generations to make all different kinds of choices about life and how they're going to afford to be able to be entrepreneurs, to be able to take risks in a lot of ways. That's part of white privilege today, because the generations that now have absorbed that inherited wealth have entirely different sets of choices and opportunities as a result of it. So I'm just trying to leverage that claim that's being made by someone like Bloomberg and force it back on them as a demand for a certain kind of social policy action.
Yeah, and add another one. If people talk about job training, for example, or education. Well, what if you get educated and there's no job waiting for you, or a good job? So there are other structural elements that need to be addressed as well when thinking about education. And then, I'll even say this, and this is not a new profound argument, the debate of, is education a credential or really indicative of a skill set that has a meaning, and obviously it's not either or, of how somebody's able to perform in task at their job, right? Does education become somewhat as a mechanism of sorting who gets access? And whether it's sorting in a way that's productivity related and how much is really just as a power mechanism, I think it's debatable. We just make the presumption that that's the solution to our problems.
To clarify, my apologies if I missed this, but when you were saying you're skeptical of certain outcomes of education, you're referring to investing in like higher education or easing educational attainment, not necessarily the quality of K-12 education.
I'm referring to both. I think that we're entitled to a quality education from grade school all the way through college. I think we can afford that, and I think that's a necessary ingredient for people to have agency in their lives. And going back to the point you were raising, we know within group, so I pointed you some statistics across group and showed you that even highly educated blacks are worse off than low educated whites. But within groups, having more education is related to better outcomes than less education, right? So I'm not denying that there is some returns to education. Again, I'm critiquing the emphasis. All right, so now I'm going to quote Barack Obama. All right. So in his 2013 commencement address at Morehouse, right, this is an elite small college in Atlanta that's predominantly black. He says, "You now hail from a lineage and legacy of immeasurably strong men who bore tremendous burdens and still laid the stones for the path on which we now walk. You wear the mantle of Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Ralph Bunche, et cetera, and yes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These men were many things to many people, and they knew full well that the role of racism played in their lives, but when it came to their own accomplishments and sense of purpose, they had no time for excuses." Then he says, "Every one of you has had a grandma, an uncle, or a parent who's told you at some point in life that as an African American, you have to work twice as hard as anyone else if you want to get by." And I know this is not unique to black people. I know women in the room have probably heard this as well. If I had a child, I might give them the same advice. But what we don't ask as a society, and by the way, Barack Obama is the president, so we should make that clear. What we don't ask is at what cost? Will there be unintended negative consequences associated with above normal effort for these highly educated, racially stigmatized black graduates in the context of a racially stratified America? We don't ask that question. If we look at the World Health Organization, the consensus regarding social determinants of health, it defines the conditions in which we grow, live, work, and age as the primary determinants of health, and likewise health disparity. I added the likewise health disparity. Common presumption is that race is relevant to the extent that it's tied to concentrations of poverty. We believe that black people, when they're able to get out of those concentrations of poverty, they have access to the American dream. The presumption is that black and Latinx populations were more educated, which in turn would result in better jobs, higher income, and health disparity would dramatically reduce or be eliminated. Here is infant mortality. And I can look at maternal mortality as well. We see, again, this phenomena of black expected mothers with a college degree have a greater likelihood of an infant death than a white expected mother who's dropped out of high school. And rather than education leading to a reduction across groups, it expands the disparities. It's not unique to infant mortality. In general, we know that black women and men, and this is work with Jen Cohen at Miami University in Ohio, we know that black men and women have about a 50% higher mortality rate compared to their white peers. What's more disheartening is that those with a college degree, black and white, that are working age, below the age of 65 and greater than the age of 25, there's a 70% higher mortality risk for those with a college degree. That's disheartening. Randy's an economist, and we know a lot of black economists. Michael knows a lot of black economists. Anecdotally, I can tell you many of my friends, and it's not a huge group, who've had a heart condition, an unusual amount for a highly educated group that's in a good work position. And obviously it's personal now. I better start thinking about it. And I'm putting on the pound. But, you know, I don't think we ask that question. That's anecdote. But, you know, as a projected project that I'm working on with Jen Cohen, is we're going to look at nurses. So this is a group that is professionally in a good occupation, good education, and even in the health field. So they have knowledge about health. So I wonder what their health consequences are relative to some other peer group. And then also, yeah, that's going to be a good group, I think, to hopefully examine and look at.
I don't mean to be nitpicking, or maybe I do.
Please.
Could you go back to the previous slide?
Yes.
I think you're making the wrong point.
Okay.
Because the important point is the extent to which infant mortality rates go down with education within racial groups. The racial comparison is important, but what it says is that the black educational advantage is not as large as the white educational advantage. And that's the way to say it. And to then say, why is it the case that the black educational advantage is not as great as the white educational advantage? The fact that the ratio goes up is a side effect of the important points. And you kind of implied, and maybe you didn't mean to imply.
I didn't. I meant to. I'll say that. I didn't mean to.
You meant to. Okay. Yeah. But you would. Okay. And I'll say then that's what the challenge is about. Is that you implied that we should be unhappy because the ratio going up is the important point. The ratio going up is not the important point. It's the relative advantage that education brings, and the fact that that's a smaller advantage for blacks. That's the important point, I would argue, because that's the mechanism that generates the ratio, which is just a side effect.
So I obviously disagree. I don't think it's just a side effect. I think that that's the conventional understanding, and that's the unsurprising understanding. Right? There's no surprise to anybody in the room that education pays off with better health outcomes. What's surprising in the room is that these gaps continue to exist and even expand with higher education. Then the next part is, well, what's the explanation and why? I mean, the fact that they continue to exist and even expand, that's disheartening. The fact that there is not the same comparable return to education for blacks as it is whites, especially in a society that offers education as the solution for disparity, that's disheartening.
That's the last sentence is the right one. Okay? That really is, that's the crucial sentence.
No, I think you're getting at whether or not there's something with the emphasis on the increase in the ratio? Is there something more deleterious as education? Is this about the compounded impact of having to try that much harder at a particular rate? So he's actually proposing a hypothesis that it's not just that as education goes up for Black folks, it doesn't have the expected wonderful effect that you'd expect it to have. Is there something happening above and beyond for those who are at a higher income because of that kind of, doing more, doing twice as much, how that might be impacting health? That's what I'm hearing, which is why I emphasis on that.
You're hearing my hypothesis.
Okay.
Well, I think part of the story there, maybe this is reinforcing your point, but putting the narrative a little bit differently, is people understand in the grand scheme of things that in the population of those with less education, Blacks are disproportionately represented, and there's a long racial history as to why that's the case. But those who have a college degree should be moving into the same place that we think of as where middle class, upper middle class Americans are. And therefore, they should be moving out of whatever that environment is that they're disproportionately represented into this thing that we think of more as the conventional, successful upper middle class. And yet, this huge disparity.
That's right.
So now I'm just trying to.
Thank you. Yeah, no. Yeah, no, thank you. That's right. Yep. I mean, and then again, it's not just infant mortality. If we look at other leading causes of mortality, cancer, heart disease, stroke, HIV infection, if we disaggregate by gender, you still see that with higher levels of education, huge disparities exist across Blacks and whites. So you got this paradox. And then the questions are there physical and psychological costs of stigma, and ironically telling people to work hard to overcome their barriers, right? This can be a metaphor in general. Tressie McMillan-Cottom, as well as Chris Seifert, they've both done work of how vulnerable, the vulnerabilities of predatory education on young Black people who are trying to overcome their circumstances. In other words, those individuals that want to, I'm all over the place, sorry. You will see ads from for-profit universities where they literally say, get up off the couch, make something of your life. You can come down here tomorrow and sign up and be enrolled in a college degree program. Maybe it's better to stay on the couch. I'm trying to make a tongue-in-cheek point that those that are trying to do something are often vulnerable to being got, either by, a lot of the financial crisis was driven by people trying to invest in a home and might not have, information asymmetries, might not have known they qualified for a prime loan. I guess I'm trying to push back a little bit on this ethos of hard work and overcoming your barriers in a context of stigma and exploitation. The here and then here, and then here, sorry.
So your argument is really about what's happening to an individual, but I guess I'd come back to the points that were made earlier about the family context, because yes, I mean, you might be right, there is an individual component, but any Black person who goes to college is more likely to be in a family network where there are going to be greater demands on them for that source than a comparable white person who goes to college. So it could be beyond the individual, it could be a broader kin network kind of argument. And I think if you put it all on the individual, you're going to miss a big piece of the inequality by race.
I think that's fair and right. I mean, clearly I don't have a causal model. I don't have the mechanisms well, I might have a causal model. I don't have causal empirical evidence. I don't have the mechanisms to capture causality. And I guess what I'm trying to allude to is that there's at least some descriptive statistics to suggest that there are structures that might be individually based, family based, larger context that lead to these perverse outcomes where what we believe to be individual choice decisions don't necessarily mitigate the inequities that we observe.
But just if I could do a quick follow-up, it seems like the policy implications depend on which of these mechanisms accounts for the lower returns to education for blacks and whites. Is it, I mean, so there might be school policies that are implicated if it's really about this too much pressure and, you know, a negative environment in college versus it's the family network that's kind of drawing down on the resources of that individual who is educationally upwardly mobile. And that's where the baby bonds program might come in more.
So I'm arguing for a policy context. I'm arguing that there are a set of goods that are so essential that they all need to be offered in a rights framework, and that even having the rights framework reduces some of the stigma. So another example would be, you know, people critique Senator Sanders for canceling all the debt or making college free for everyone, public college free for everyone. They say, well, you're helping out rich people. Why are you doing that? You know, smart answer is if Donald Trump's children want to go to Penn State, good. I don't care, right? But the big point, I got to stop with my jokes. I'm losing their effect. Now I'm getting on your nerves, I can see. But the bigger point is that if you have it in a rights frame, you remove some of the stigma. At UCLA, I bet you all know who the financial aid students are. And that's unfortunate. And to deny that financial aid students are treated the same as non-financial aid students is not the same. So if you simply had it as a place where the burden of finance is removed at the point of delivery of the education, similar to Medicare for all, removing the burden of finance at that point removes some of the stigma and trauma associated with certain groups to begin with. So that's, you know, I'm arguing for a set of policies in addition to baby bonds to try to change society to mitigate stigma altogether. I forgot the hands. There were a couple more hands. I lost track. Okay, whoever was next, I guess.
So there's probably a lot of literature written about the relative impact of different types of racial stigma. You mentioned like predatory lending, you think of redlining, you think of a lot of different ways. And so I'm wondering if there's a way, you know, one could collect data. I mean, it wouldn't help for much except to maybe prioritize policies. Like this is a more severe, harmful, racially stratifying, you know, practice that we need to like confront more than say another. But I'm wondering like how much variation there is, and also if there's a way to kind of track these sort of practices and how they're correlated with certain biomarkers like blood pressure and so on. So because there's also this, so there's that, and then there's the other thing I'm hearing is about the hard work and like how you measure like how many hours a person is putting, and then in the back of this is what you started with, which is wealth as a cushion. You know, that wealth is a resource that makes people less vulnerable to these racially stigmatizing practices. So I'm wondering, you know, how you could design a survey, kind of bring in all these things longitudinally in like a panel data set to kind of get at you know, what is most harmful and what we could prioritize policies to deal with that.
I think that's right. I think that's a good approach, and I appreciate that. I know with this study design, one approach that I want to get at, and by the way, obviously there's a deep health literature about this stuff, and I'm not giving you all the citations. There's John Henryism that we know about, which has done some scales to try to get at people's locus of controls, how much effort they put into their daily lives, or agency that they believe they have in affecting their life outcomes, and how that correlates or doesn't correlate with returns to blood pressure within race and in comparisons of blacks versus whites. So there is this literature that's already built up. But one of the things that we want to do with this is try to look at various health outcomes, mortality-related outcomes, and try to compare the intersections of race, education, and whether the ailment is something that is more congenital or socially determined, we would expect that the more socially determined ailments is ones in which we would find the greatest across-group difference in gradients of education to try to support our hypothesis if that's true or not.
So it seems like separating congenital out won't quite be enough if the goal, and I can't quite, but if the goal is to separate how racism and structural racism affects health from the specific mechanism of racial as stigma, I think this may be related to what Judy was getting at. That, right there, I mean, I could think of a lot of reasons why African Americans with high levels of education would have lower returns to health, poorer health outcomes because of racism in the health system, in nutritional practices, whatever it might be. But you're getting, I think what you're getting at, or maybe this you can confirm, is specifically this John Henry effect, or that the stigma, either the effort that people exert to work so hard, to work twice as hard, or the pressure that people feel. And I think about this a lot with students that say are from diverse racial backgrounds, and that it's not just the pressure of, oh, you're on financial aid, there's also the pressure of you're standing in for an entire group of people and you bear these responsibilities. But it is a subtle distinction, and you can get it to some extent with looking at employment, but I'm just wondering if that's sort of where you're at headed, and if there's a strategy to kind of nail that down.
Yeah, I mean, as y'all are articulating, it's going to be difficult to decipher some of the specific sources of stigma, but there are some ways. And to the extent that we can use variation in disease type that might be more or less related to certain types of stigma, that's going to be the mechanism of identification. You didn't have you here, sorry. Y'all got to help me with the cue. I can't remember. Okay.
My question, so while you were talking, and I'm a measurement person, I do health measurement, I was thinking, well, maybe the issue is that we need to diversify the way we think about wealth, because health contributes to something that's sort of passed down in the way that we're thinking about wealth, and that certain groups are ended up getting a disproportionate experience of stress that is then, I would think of as intergenerational. Then I was thinking of the work of Dr. Celie Jefferson, who's at the Ohio State with you, who her recent paper draws a relationship between incarceration and maternal health outcomes. But then at some point I started thinking, this is a rabbit hole. We're going to continue to say that you need to produce better data, better research to tie in all these relationships when there are over 50 years of papers that speak to these relationships. So then what is our strategy? Do you have recommendations for how do we actually stop piecemealing policy? Because we have the proof. We don't need to just focus on one policy, to your point. There's too many to target. So what is our better strategy than keep targeting one policy, keep producing new papers to draw distinctions? How do we do this?
Good question. So, I'll start with the cheap answer to begin with. It's not either or, right? One could pursue both, but I think the point you raised is a good question about the political economy of the academy. Are we too timid? Are we not having the social impact that we can have because of perhaps even a shelter that becomes self-imposed on us of saying, I don't have the proof or the depth, so I'm going to be that. And that does not mean that we don't continue to seek for the truth in relationships by applying our craft of rigor to decipher relationships in a more coherent, clear way. So in that sense, I don't think it's either or. We can do both. But I'm hearing your question as also a call of action that real lives are hurt by this, that this is impacting people's lives, and we are a privileged group that's highly state subsidized. And, I can get, You see, I'm not afraid to do it, I don't care. I'll get on my soapbox and say a call to action that I think, you know, you might not see the result, you might not see the facts the way I see it, but there is a call of action for us to engage and try to make a difference in people's lives with our craft. So I appreciate the question.
So I just wanted to come back to this differential returns to college and that blacks have lower returns to college than whites. I think in some outcomes that may be true, but there's a lot of evidence where the returns to college are quite a bit higher for blacks than for whites. And so you're presenting some descriptive evidence, but of course if you go into kind of looking at the causal effects of college, you can see a lot of places where blacks have a better return than whites. So in some ways, I understand the point of emphasizing that there's not equalization and that education is not a panacea. But it makes me sometimes nervous when there is a statement that the returns are lower for blacks, whether it kind of sends a message of rhetoric that colleges are paying off for this group and whether we should be limiting access for certain groups kind of gets, you know, tossed into this when we're not emphasizing the high returns for blacks.
So I guess I have a threefold response. One is, without ambiguity, I think college is a good thing, and everybody should have access to college, period. So I lead with that for it as an outcome in and of itself. It is important, and we should not ration it to people based on ability to pay or their race. Second, I'm not familiar of those outcomes for which college does not have in which college has a higher return for blacks as opposed to whites. And that's an honest, I'm really not. And many of the outcomes that I've looked at in the labor market and wealth, it is the case that college does not pay off to the extent for blacks as it does whites.
I don't mean that it pays off to the extent, just that the differential, so that what they would have been earning in the absence of college is higher than what whites would have been earning in the absence of college. So not that it's equalized.
Well, that's not true in wage outcomes. It's not true with regards to, well, I mean, I can wholeheartedly say that's true. That in terms of labor market wage returns, blacks get a lower return for college than do whites. Now, there's some evidence that, so there's been some work about, does an Ivy League education relatively pay off for blacks compared to a non-Ivy League education? And now there is some evidence here that that whether a black person goes to the University of Penn versus Penn State is more meaningful for them than it is a white person, whether they go to Penn State or Penn. But the payoff to the University of Penn for a white person, based on my reading of the literature, is higher for a white person than it is a black person. Then, you know, the last point I'll say is that it is the case that some colleges in certain contexts really doesn't pay off. There are some colleges that are exploitive that lead to debt traps for which the labor market returns, the returns in terms of a whole lot of analytical ability, et cetera, I would assess that it's a bad investment for black people. And that's the sobering problem, right? I guess that's not an easy answer to give you in return, but that, to me, that's the point. That is the context that we're in.
Other questions? We have time for just a couple. Oh,
Yeah, if other people have already had a chance to speak, could you go back to your slide that starts with paradox? Yeah, paradox, there. Yeah, I don't think I articulated the point I was trying to make very well. And what you seem to be suggesting, and this is what I'm challenging, is that somehow it's worse in some respects to be, say, college educated than for a black person than not to be. I know you just said that college is a good thing for everybody, but the suggestion was, I thought that I heard you, to say that things like high blood pressure and so on may be, or the aspects of stress may be worse if you're a black person who goes to college than if you're a black person who doesn't go to college.
You didn't hear me say that, and I don't believe that. So
that's all I was challenging,
Okay.
was the implication that somehow, in some respects, you're worse off. And you're not saying that, okay, I'm, wait a minute,
Okay.
It's the racial difference.
Did you want to make a point and then here? Okay.
You've mentioned policy a few times, and I feel like that might be coming later on the slides, and we might not
Although
get
it's about
to it.
the,
Yeah, and so what I want to ask is, you brought up in your initial opening remarks about like the neoliberal paradigm really emphasizes agency and freedom and cloaks these ideas as what's truly individualistic, but the progressives do that too. That is not just a conservative thing. So, you know, assuming the audience here is progressive and liberal, like how do we hold our own selves accountable for having those same theories of like the bootstrap theory and like, you know, you can dig yourself out and all this stuff, when rather than this idea of like what's best for the public, you know? And how do you see these Democratic candidates holding themselves accountable to this?
I'm with you, which is why I put that slide of Barack Obama up, because Barack Obama is often used, and he uses himself to make this point, as he's a black person, and he's a Democrat, so seemingly liberal. But I gave you that one speech, but he went into the NAACP 100th anniversary and said, I'm no different from that black child who grew up in the south side of Chicago or Harlem. The difference is I had a mother who loved me, who gave me some breaks. And if not for the grace of God, there go I, right? So that's that rhetoric, that if you got the right family values, if you do the right thing, you will be fine. Obviously, what's omitted from his narrative is that his single-parent mother had a PhD, and that he went to elite private schools in Hawaii and Indonesia, so he didn't have the experiences of that child that grew up in the south side of Chicago. So it has become the consensus that education, every president since Nixon for black economic development has proposed two things: black capitalism through small businesses and education. The consensus for Republicans, Democrats, blacks, and whites alike is that largely racism was a thing of the past that civil rights has made de jure illegal. Disparities still exist and racism still exists, but there are lots of opportunities, and if you have personal investments, you can overcome your obstacles. So the remaining disparities are largely due to some behaviors or attitudes internal to blacks themselves. And then the last one, the last trope that's often given, is that what somebody else has labeled multicultural liberalism. That you are not unique as a black person. There's a white woman who struggles, there's a disabled person who struggles. The notion that everybody faces barriers and discrimination in society, which is true, and I'm not minimizing any of that. But the arguments are usually put forth in a trope that because you're not special, stop asking for special treatment, stop making excuses. And Obama said this also: black people need to put their lot in life for better health care, better, I forgot whatever else, with that of all Americans. Right? So that has become a trope, in my view, of explaining racial inequality. One, that we've largely overcome, remaining disparities are internal to blacks themselves, and then last, that you're not special, that everybody faces barriers, so stop your belly aching. So now you might be saying, well, what's the solution? So I talked about reparations, and reparations is not sufficient, but I think, and it might not happen tomorrow, but if America is ever going to get beyond its original sin or racial problem, it has to have that truth and reconciliation. And it's, we can talk about native populations as well. But we have to have that full-throated, honest conversation. That doesn't mean that if we don't do reparations, we can't make progress. The other component, which I think I'm committed to and have been convinced by, is an economic rights frame. And it started with FDR's New Deal in reaction to a similar concentration that we face right now. Unfortunately, there was that Faustian bargain that sold out a whole population of people in order to get a legislative victory of maintaining racial hierarchy. So there are lessons to be learned, because that doesn't have to be our destiny. And then, I tried to lead with the values of how we can overcome that, which is an authentic focus on our common humanity. If we are able to overcome the selfish desires for having horizontal relative positioning, that's real. And not, oftentimes progressives also just say, if we all just work together, it'll be in our collective best interest, why should we? That's naive and negating the benefits of white privilege. It's not easy white people would have to give something up tangible. And in order to do so, something has to be offered to them that's more value. And I believe that the proposition is one grounded in morality. But at the end of the day, recognition that there are essential set of goods that are critical if people are really going to have authentic agency in their lives.